Hello everyone, it's Niz, and this time around, for real, I'm going to be covering a game I had my eyes on for a while. I'm going to be covering Heartbeat. Heartbeat is a game by Chumbosoft, a JRPG where you play as a girl named Eve working alongside her battle partner Klein. The game takes place in a world where humans and these animalistic creatures called Mogwai coexist. They work together with a bunch of friends they make along the way to make the world of Salome a safer place. And Eve is caught up in the ever-growing tension between human and Mogwai. But before I go too deep into the story of the game, I would like to first go over the gameplay. Starting out how every battle does, this game has a special encounter system, where the enemy moves around the overworld, with 3 different types being the most common. One that moves in random directions, one that will chase after you, and one that will try to run away. However, the encounter types are not based on level, meaning that enemies you're 90 levels above will still be gnawing at your ankles when you're backtracking to lower level areas. Fortunately, the shortcuts in the game not only reduce the time to backtrack, but also take routes that are far more clear of enemies. The gameplay of Heartbeat overall is pretty standard for your turn-based JRPG, with an emphasis on a system I was never really a fan of in RPGs, and that's the elemental system. I know this isn't specific to Heartbeat, but I will still go on a bit of a tangent because this will become relevant. I've never really liked elemental systems because it adds a level of management I don't usually care for, but another thing I've recently realized is the most annoying part to me is having to learn a new elemental system, because each game finds the need to vary up their sense of rock, paper, scissors. To really demonstrate this, I'm going to get out a chart. As you can see, there are 10 elements. Each element has one they are weak to, and one they are strong against. Relatively simple, could maybe use a few less elements, but other than that, it seems like it'd be really easy to get a hold of. Except funny enough, this was far more difficult to get a hold of because it focuses on raw memorization rather than reasoning. You could make an excuse for all these matchups, but since they all only have one strength and one weakness, if you're not following the elements by their specific rules, you can very easily screw it up. Shadow is strong against Flora, but Fire isn't. Volt is strong against wind, but not water, and Flora has nothing to do with Earth. Even though the logic behind Shadow being strong against Flora is that it denies its ability to photosynthesize, surely Earth in general would be vulnerable to Flora as it would take root into it for its nourishment. Elements also have a hidden rule, one that makes sense but also makes it even worse to think about. They are resistant to their own element, meaning they resist 2 elements while only being weak to 1. The simplicity is admirable because it avoids having to remember a bunch of other stuff like other elemental systems, but it ironically leads to more memorization if you want to utilize this. I find I much more prefer an elemental system with multiple solutions, so I don't have to dig in my memory for the one answer. Meanwhile, in Heartbeat, the answer is, use this element. You don't have that? Okay, then just don't use these. This is not only a lack of variety, but also an issue that becomes more apparent through the game as your party members, with the exception of 4, all can only deal damage or use spells based on their elements. There are 12 party members. Only 3 of them can use more than 2 elements. Only 2 of them can gain access to all of them. And only one of those can get all of them before reaching the final chapter of the game. There's also consumables that can deal elemental damage, but until far later in the game, you won't find a shop that sells you whichever type you want, so your only option for that is buying them at a vending machine where they are randomized. So the reason this lack of control is such an issue is that despite the game encouraging such specific matchups, you don't get many opportunities to take advantage of them, as a lot of areas will only have a few different types of enemies, but the player only has access to the types Eve has available, and which elements her allies are designated to, so usually you'll be playing with the cards the game deals to you in that part of the story over anything else. I should use this opportunity to talk about the elements of the primary characters, Eve and Klein. These 2 will almost always be in your party. One has no element, and the other is designated light. With this, outside of a couple of occasions, you're pretty much always going to have 2 spots filled. I don't cover this only because it limits your counter options, however, but the fact that every character has a different ability that can be used to overcome obstacles. But this also means that you need to use these characters at specific times to reach certain areas in the game, since in most of them, you require their ability to access these secret areas. Spots that are not only hiding valuable treasure, but create pathways for shortcuts, and openings to start and or progress in certain side quests. So if you don't make sure to backtrack and utilize these characters while you have them in the moment, this content becomes inaccessible until you complete the game and are able to pick whichever party member you please on a whim. There is one wildcard I wanted to point out for the gameplay aspect, and that's Mott. You can name this critter whatever you want once you get it, but its canonical name is Mott. I bring this creature up as it's an extra party member. It does not take up a slot and cannot be attacked, but as a result, Mott does not count as a party member when factoring in anyone who can fight. This character can use DNA to transform into smaller versions of characters in the game, and use their skills and elements. Mott's ability use is randomized from this pool of abilities, so it can be a mixed bag of how useful it is. Thank you, Mott. DNAs become more powerful when used as some sort of secondary level, which will unlock further abilities and allow Mott to use a special ability at the start of transforming. You can also feed Mott as it gains levels to increase its bonuses and certain stats. The visual changes are admittedly minimal, they're simply a color palette change, but it is good to have an indicator for the special abilities they unlock. Unfortunately, this food is dropped randomly from enemies, so you can't collect them until you reach a certain area that has a jam shop, which is a ways into the game, but I do appreciate that there is a food that reduces hunger and the stats at the same time. This gives you plenty of opportunity, past the halfway point at least, to experiment with what type of forms and bonuses you want on Mott. While on the subject of special features for characters, the game's equipment system is very bare bones. You can complete the game without upgrading any of your gear and be just fine. A big part of that is that you can't really change any of the party members' gear except for their weapons, which are just stat boosts, except for Eve, whose armor and accessories can add different elemental resistances later on in the game, as well as the occasional stat boost. In the game's defense, there are a couple of weapons that have different small bonuses, but in reality I rarely notice these differences, so unfortunately, there's not much you're missing out on if you don't explore them. It can be a double-edged sword because you don't have to micromanage every character, but I also would have liked to have more gimmicks, especially in a game like this where a majority of the equipment are side grades. Which is something I tend to notice with Heartbeat. Element matchups are pretty useful if they're in your favor, but honestly, the simpler stuff gets the job done anyway. I see no reason to play around with these elements even in the parts of the game I have control over them versus utilizing buffs and debuffs. If a stat has a physical and magical aspect, it'll decrease both of them, set effects stack twice, and the duration of the stacks resets on using the ability again, making it incredibly easy to maintain. I don't know the actual percentage change in these stats, but they are potent enough to make a fight take a complete 180. Because of this, most single enemy bosses ended up becoming a breeze since I dropped their damage to pitiful amounts, while making their defense so low that they take drastically more damage from all sources. The game does have a few bits of side content, such as the training belts that you gain by completing boss battles, which also unlocks new sets of abilities for all party members. There's also of course this alchemy area as shown earlier, which can be used initially to craft consumables, but I'm gonna be honest, I never really used the alchemy table for the majority of the game. The consumables you can craft here you can just buy en masse anywhere else, that way you don't waste the crafting materials you'll need for more important things later. And by more important things, I just mean the better weapons that you can craft for them, and using the rest of it to feed your favorite party members to raise their stats by 2. With this alchemy book only unlocking certain sections once you progress far enough in the game or complete certain quests, and a majority of those things being things you just unlocked in the shop, there feels like no reason to use it outside of the weapon upgrades and the pseudo level ups. A lot of stuff that's not even worth concerning about until the post-game. But I can't talk too much about that until I reach the story, so in regards to side content, I'm gonna cover the art and audio. Heartbeat's art style is very warm and welcoming overall, with a lovely animated background, the cutesy design of characters, and the enemy animations bouncing up and down during combat, making it feel more lively. Usually it's hit or miss with me when it comes to this type of stuff, and for me, this did hit. But there is something that's gotten to me frequently throughout the game, and that's trying to figure out the elements of enemies based on their appearance. For a lot of them, I either make the wrong assumption or have no clue what they are at first. And yes, I understand not every Mog's going to be an obvious guess, but let me try to put this in perspective. What element is this Mog? Toxic. What about this one? Wind. This one? Ice. Ice? Is there really any sort of indicator other than maybe the colors being white and blue? Maybe it's just me, but these Mogs don't have any telltale signs of their element. Although in the game's defense, it sometimes compensates this by giving them effects that better indicate what their type is. But this is usually an occurrence for bosses, which was definitely needed because some of them have elements that do not match their species. But I'm starting to leak back into gameplay. Let's get back on track as I cover the real mixed bag of this content, and that's the audio. A lot of the sound effects are definitely RPG Maker assets, and the game's completely in its right to use those. A lot of games I love to use these sound effects, which is kind of the problem because I begin associating these sounds with those games. But that's not where it ends, as the game also uses audio provided free by Muse, which ends up making up a lot of the town and route music. They're not bad, but they do stand out compared to the game's soundtrack. I think this was either done because the developer really liked this music or something along those lines, because the composer did a pretty good job making a quality soundtrack for the game. So it's not like them trying to put ketchup on a bad dish or anything like that. Every party member has their own theme and a battle remix of the theme, and anyone familiar with this channel will know how much I love when a game does that. One I especially like is Troz, as the drums do a great job of imposing a presence while having a theme that itself sounds playful. It does a really good job in conveying a giant dog causing more damage than intended. I really do wish the game had more than one standard battle theme though, because it's a fairly long game and even your favorite battle theme is going to just become white noise after a while. There is one thing I really like about the game, and it's attention to detail in certain areas. The notes in the game, for example, rather than just having text go over the screen or read it out in the text box, has the character holding the notes. And not only that, the hand will actually change depending on who's leading the party at the time. I don't think I've seen this level of creativity with notes since One Shot. It's an impressive little detail when considering the very few notes in this game are optional, and you could quite possibly go through the entire game without even looking at them. But these notes do a pretty good job of setting up the game's story. Speaking of which, if you intend to continue to watch this video without spoilers, you can skip to this part. If you already know the story and want the plot breakdown, here's this part. For everyone else, let's get started. The story begins with Eve and Klein working together in their grandfather's store to clear out some supplies in the shop of her grandfather. She's moved into the small town of Sunwich in the outset to work in his store. They speak with her grandfather, and are set out to visit the town on the other side of the woods to retrieve things from a shopping list. As they go through said woods, strange things begin to occur. They end up facing feral mogs, and run into some strange people, one being a tanuki named Shep who is a shopkeeper, and the other being a strange woman with an immense fascination with mogwai. Her name is June, and she actually has the potential of becoming a conjurer, as Klein points out. But they don't have time for this. Once they fight through the woods, they reach the town and get the list of goods. Set to return home with a full list of stuff, the two run into more than the average feral mogs, and a strange blue-haired lady, who frantically makes her way past them. They end up running into a Cerberus who mistakes them for the thief. Once the Cerberus is defeated, the type of theft becomes clear. Part of her core had been stolen, a mog's core being sort of an organ inside the mog that contains their soul. She appears to be in a very bad state after being defeated by Eve and Klein along with the missing piece of her core, and says that she needs to make a pact to recover. A pact is a sort of symbiosis between a human that has the potential to become a conjurer and a mogwai willing to work alongside a human. If they're a good match, they can make a pact. Any conjurer can make a pact with up to 2 mogwai. Pacts not only make mogwai stronger, but also apparently help them with recovering from injuries. It can help them regenerate their core quickly. June, in hopes that Eve would lead her to some more interesting mogwai, had followed her and approaches the Cerberus and is revealed to be a compatible human. She agrees to make a pact with the Cerberus and helps her recover. At this point, we learn that non-feral mogs, rather than having transformations for stronger versions of their species, have a human form, and Troz changes to that after the pact and feels much healthier. It turns out that the Cerberus is a royal guard of the Den, the home of mogs underground, which has the group wondering why someone with that job is so far from home. It turns out that Troz is here to protect someone, the heir to the throne, Princess Rexford. Eve talks Klein into going home and convincing Shep to have one of her relatives set up a decoy and pretend that Eve went home and finished her job. With that, they go into the tunnels with Troz to find Rex being harassed by mercenaries. These mercs, the Terror Trio, make their leave when Troz intervenes and convinces them that she's not worth their time. She apparently was not the priority of their job. The group makes their exit as the thief has taken part of Rex's core and she needs help. The party regroup to June's house and she makes a pact with Rex as well. They conclude they have to go through the tunnel to Arrows as that's the only way the thief could have gone. There's also a mog in the town of Arrows that has a registry of mogwai that will help them track down the one responsible, as their only current lead is that it's a wisp, and a strong one. Once they get the arrows, however, the Mog in question has gone missing, and as it turns out, she's being held up by one of the members of the terror trio, also trying to get information on the Wisp. It appears that the thief is the priority target. The party defeats Pike and helps Chip get home. She has Rex and Troz written down in a registry, and they get details from her that the only Wisp that are powerful enough to defeat a Cerberus are ones experimented on by a scientist in Noteco. But it has been a long and busy day, and now they have a lead that's not going anywhere. So the team returns to their homes and gets some rest before going back on the trail. Eve and Klein end up traveling through Foxetter Forest to find Chip, who went missing. As it turns out, she was attacked, not only having a piece of her core stolen, but her registry book as well. Chip joins the party as recovering the book has become her priority one. They decide to take their leave and travel to Oteco. They end up tailing the Terror Trio along the way, as they likely know the Wisp's location. But then they pick the fight with the Mog they mistook for their leader. However, they befriend the Mogs here as the one that they mistook for the leader actually had a lot of bad blood with the actual leader of the Terror Trio. With that trail now cold, they decide to go with their original plan of heading to Oteco to meet Luca. She is the scientist responsible for the experimentation there. After some persuasion, they get her to come along, and she begins to talk about ominous things about how she and Klein know each other. This, however, does not seem to be a concern, so Luca gives her information on the only Wisp she knows that could be that powerful. A Wisp that lives in Hairbay. The group make their way there and defeat two of the members of the Terror Trio, where once they're defeated, one of them outright begs to get another knuckle drop. But the other, the member of the group they fought earlier, proved to be rather cooperative, as with no coercion and no threats, gives the lead of where they last saw this Wisp. Afterwards, Eve tells Pike, the cooperative Mog, that if they find and defeat the Wisp first, they'll be more than happy to hand her over. The goal, after all, being to stop this from continuing. Through the route, they reach Hairbury and speak to the conjurer of the Wisp, and are told that she's in a grotto northeast of town. On their way in, they bump into a strange girl from earlier, and Klein seems to have a strange reaction, but they continue on because they don't have time to waste. Once they reach the end of the cave, they find the Wisp and fight against her as she becomes incredibly aggressive. When defeating her, they began reasoning with the Wisp, and it turns out she was the wrong target, and that she actually had a part of her core taken out by the perpetrator. The thief was a Reaper, which is a Wisp that experiences so much trauma that develops into their own form of power. Reapers used to be made to be the executioners of the den. They proved to be effective as they could reach into one's body and access their core. This Wisp had an artificial core, which was presumably made by all the pieces she's been taking, and she's been using the stolen registry to hunt down Mogs that would be a match for said core. But it is also revealed that Klein knows the Reaper. Luca and Chip make their leave, however, as Luca, believing this is out of her league, and Chip, keeping her promise to her conjurer that she would come home alive, has no intention of facing a Mog far more powerful and with such lethal abilities. Io, on the other hand, offers to join the party in hunting down the Reaper, stating that she had Luca change her element to fire for this exact type of thing. Once even Klein gets some rest, she fully intends to join them on their journey. Unfortunately, Klein becomes horribly ill. They return to Io and her conjurer Beck and see what's wrong with her. They figure out there's an infection in her core, and Eve has to clean it personally by entering the realm of Klein's core. Klein seems very apprehensive towards this, because entering Klein's core means that Eve will learn a lot more about her history than she cares to share. But with no other choice, Eve embarks on this unpleasant journey. Through this, Eve learns about Klein's experience while being a Mog wife for her grandmother. She already knew Klein worked with her grandmother, but never really was told much about what happened over the years. Her grandmother had a rare mutation among humans that made her a Wuji conjurer, which made her capable of making pacts with up to 3 Mogs rather than 2, and allowed her to make pacts with Mogs of the opposite sex. These 3 were a Wisp named Nyx, her first Mog, Caesar, the den's general, and a cat Sith named Klein. She was invited to the den as a human ambassador, maintaining the peace between human and Mogs, the first human to set foot in the den since the war, which unfortunately for her was going to be much more difficult. As time went on, the king and queen had an egg, but with the queen growing more cold and distant, there was not enough love among the two to allow the egg to hatch. The king, feeling an emptiness in his life, had an affair behind the queen's back with the den's general, Caesar, who, as mentioned earlier, was one of Eve Jin's Mogs. The two had an egg. The queen was outraged by this, stating that no matter what happens here, her not making an example of those involved makes her look weak. She approaches Klein, stating that killing Caesar wouldn't send the message she intends. She wants his conjurer dead instead. She wanted Klein to assassinate Eve Jin. Klein not long after spoke to Luca, requesting a poison that would bring a quick death, but Klein had different ideas than the Queen, and was plotting to assassinate the Queen. Her rapier couldn't pierce dragon scales, so she got a ceremonial dagger and coated it with the poison. However, Klein failed in her attempt and left behind the intended murder weapon, which the Queen found. She knew Klein had attempted to kill her, but the weapon left behind was a ceremonial dagger used by humans, and so the Queen used this to her advantage, and twisted the story to be that Eve Jin attempted to assassinate her. This would be used as an excuse for her arrest and likely execution. As the guards approach, Klein, guilt-ridden by her actions, takes the opportunity to grab Eve Jin and makes a break for it, leaving Caesar and Nyx behind. Caesar defeated all of his former subordinates, but when facing the Queen couldn't defeat her. The Queen, after all, is the result of the inherited power of godlike Mogwai that restored Solom in its darkest time. The Queen took his weakened body and wore it like a twisted puppet. Him being forced to live out the rest of his days with no control over his body was to be set as an example to other Mogwai, that when you cross the Queen, death is a luxury. Wisps were vilified, given the reputation of traitors due to the events that have occurred. Most Minotaur were banished from the den due to their failure to stop the acts of treason, being replaced by the Cerberus species. With no hope of getting his and Caesar's egg back, the king fled the den with the Queen's egg as a final act of spite. However, he was slain by a hunting group in Snover, a village full of tough humans who killed packless Mogs who entered their territory. The hunters, as the legend says, kept the egg as a sort of trophy for their achievement. Dragon Mogwai are indeed rare, and this was a moment of celebration from their perspective. Despite Eve Jin insisting that they go back for Caesar and Nyx, Klein told her repeatedly that there was no hope of being able to fix this. Klein, not being able to allow herself to remain in Eve Jin's life after everything she had done, broke her pact and left. Klein still watched her live her life from a distance. Eve Jin gave up conjuring, had settled down, and had a family. It appeared that as an attempt to cope with the life she had lost, she created a new one. The outset and the den become more separate with the lack of an ambassador, and tensions began to heighten from the events that had occurred. After 200 years, Klein had met Eve, the first descendant of Eve Jin that was a compatible conjurer. She made a pact with Eve and swore to protect her. She has no hope of stopping the Queen from controlling Caesar. She has no hope of rescuing Nyx. But she had Eve, and she was her opportunity to make amends, to finally do something right. Once getting past all this, Eve finds the source of Klein's illness, the new general of the den, Yorshk. Eve defeats her and sends her retreating, but by morning several Mogs, some of which being Eve's friends, were driven mad by the influences of the new general. After defeating them all and regrouping with Io, they follow the trail to the Reaper to Snover. But to reach Snover, they need a boat from Balfort. Trekking through the woods, however, they run into the Terror Trio once more, who had actually captured the Wisp. But infighting began when it's revealed that Pike has made a pact with a human. Their leader, Wake, accuses Pike of treason. The group face the Terror Trio, who now has Nyx, and Pike sides with them to protect her conjurer. They defeat the two, but they proceed to make their escape to Snover, in an attempt to reach the den and claim their bounty. Pike joins along with the group at this point, seeing the Terror Trio is blind and the Queen is mad, and has now resolved herself to bringing peace between Mogwai and humanity again. They convince a Snoverian citizen into letting them ride along in their cargo since they can provide competent pilot, and make their way to the island. They then find Wake and Skip not far from the docking area. Nyx had taken a piece of Skip's core and the fish used to understand Snoverians and ran off. Wake apologizes to Pike for pushing her around and gives her the last of the Blabblefish so that they can understand the locals. With the core piece Wake gives to Skip, she will, unfortunately, survive. With no more distractions, they head off to the village and find Nyx on the way there. Nyx reveals that she is creating the artificial core out of pieces of conjured Mogs to trap the Queen and free Caesar. Klein confronts Nyx directly and, for the first time in several years, uses her human form. They face Nyx and manage to defeat her, and she makes her escape further in towards Snover. Unfortunately, Io and Pike have to stay behind as they are not Eve's conjurer, and Snoverians are trained to see the cues for that. They would be executed on sight, so Eve and Klein find Nyx just before she is to be executed. Her blue hair made her seem like a Snover citizen on first glance, but they are natural hunters and could tell that she was a Mog, one without a conjurer. Eve attempts to lie to save her, and the conjurer of the village, Rain, sees through this lie, but is tempted to a proposal, a challenge between two combat conjurers and their Mogs. If Eve won, Nyx would be let off the hook this time. If Rain won, Eve would be forced to watch the execution. After Eve defeats Rain and her Mog, Khan, Rain runs off. Nyx, with a newfound gratitude towards Eve and likely seeing Eve the same way Klein had, joined forces with her. They abandoned Nyx's artificial core as it was incomplete, made of negative memories, and frankly half the Mogwai she stole cores from weren't even conjured at the time. They were to work on a new core, a complete one made by those who had willingly given their pieces. Fortunately, Eve had already retrieved several core shards from her friends in her journey. She only had to retrieve a few more to complete a core, so they venture out to get more core pieces, including Volt, Flora, Earth, and Wind. They get Flora and Earth from completing favors for Chip and Shep, and they get Volt from Rex, but only when they defeat her in a battle and attempting to reason with her. With them working together with the thief that now conspires against the queen who raised her, she finds herself in an uncertain state. But after their battle, they manage to reason with Rex and convince her that the course of action is necessary for stopping the queen from doing anything extreme and saving her father. Once they get all the core pieces, Eve is rewarded for her hard work defeating the clusters throughout Solum. Not only from stories of a time long past, but with a mirror that is said to protect one from evil. It was owned by the queen, who was pushed around and abused by her conjurer, which was actually the catalyst of the human-Mog war, as the Mogwai didn't appreciate their queen being used by a human. Eve leaves with this mirror and this newfound information and heads over to Snover, as there is a gate there that can lead to the den. But Rain is guarding it, refusing to move without a rematch, one-on-one. Eve once again defeats Rain, and she takes it just as well as she did last time. In her outrage, she spills the beans and reveals to Khan that she wasn't found and adopted, but rather the egg from the legend that was taken from the slain dragon. Khan is revealed to be the half-daughter of the king. Khan is outraged by this and accuses Rain of just making a pact with her just to use her as a battery to enhance her own strength as a combat conjurer. She joins the party to see the den and meet her other father. This turns out to be really handy as they still need the wind core piece. Nyx uses the gate key to open the portal, and the group enters the den. Khan rushes ahead, and Eve promises Rain that she'll bring her back once this is all sorted. In the den's entrance, they are halted by the guardian Cerberus, but Rex's title as royalty allows them through. They are stopped by more guards further in, and these guards refuse to let them in until the gang shenanigans in town are sorted. The group splits up to deal with both sources. Eve and Klein manage to find Khan trying to get through, but unable to, and Klein, while opening the gate through a small hole, is captured by General Yorsk. Eve is very distraught about this and is unsure that she can complete this journey without Klein. Khan, doing her best to comfort Eve, gives her a piece of her core and promises her they will find Klein. The two travel on to find the gang in the temple and defeat them. It turns out they were given a rumor by the general to encourage them to behave this way. They are grouped with Nyx and Rex and work with them to defeat the other gang who were there for the same reason. It was becoming clear that Yorsk orchestrated all of this to capture Klein. The guards, after retrieving the news and having letters from both elders of the villages, were now permitted to enter, or so they thought, as the Sirens discard the letters and refuse them entry, simply assuming that they wouldn't get this far. They defeat the Siren guards while the Cerberus stands down, and once they're defeated, allows the group entry to the palace, believing in Eve's cause. Once they reach entrance, Rex rushes in and Nyx follows suit, but Eve hesitates, stating that she can sense Klein isn't in there, and Khan remains beside her to find Klein. They take an alternate route and reach the general's quarters, and find that she's in the middle of attempting to instill insanity on Klein. The general retreats, certain that Nyx and Rex were captured without the assistance of Khan and Eve, and states that with Rex out of the picture, the general has gained enough traction that she will likely be granted the honor of queen once Han dies or steps down. With Klein rescued, she doubles down in her resolve and gives Eve a piece of her core to complete the set, and they enter the palace only to be captured at the entrance. They have the group imprisoned, but Nyx sneaks her way out and helps the rest of the group escape. They fight past guards that get in their way and enter the throne room after defeating the general once more. In the room they find Caesar, struggling to continue his life with the agony of being possessed by Queen Han, mixed with the weakened state he is in from his conjurer dying a year ago, ending the pact. Caesar's body springs up and Han tries to take control of Eve's body, to reign and end humanity by her hand. But with the mirror Eve has been given, she reflects it back into Caesar. The group fights Caesar with hesitation and brings him to his knees. He's forced back up by Han, and the group destroys his chains restraining him as to break the grip Han has over him. Nyx uses her Reaper powers to pull out Han and put her into the artificial core. The group is pulled into the core as well and forced to fight the self-loathing and doubt of the owners of each shard. Once they defeat the uncertainty within each shard of the core, they are ejected out, and the Queen fights them assuming the forms of every Mog piece containing her. Once they defeat all of her forms in her human form, Han transforms into her dragon form and defeats Eve. At that moment, every person Eve has helped calls out to support her, and all the Mogwai synchronize with Eve, allowing her to conjure them at will. And they all face Han in her final godlike form as Eve attempts to reason with her. Once they defeat Han, the group is able to reason with her and convince her that humanity is not beyond redemption. This is the true ending to Heartbeat. Now, I'm going to touch on stuff a bit more lightly here than my Indivisible review, mostly because there's a lot more story in this one, and I don't want to go too deep in the lore, and trust me, it's gonna be easy this time. This is a long game. By the end of it, your party will be sitting at level 90. The game in general goes between 30 to 40 hours, so this is definitely a longer one. Longer than it had to be in my opinion, as although it doesn't make you go around in random encounters and grind, the game has a lot of busy work to compensate. The story here may seem long, but that was after I cut out a bunch of needless parts, like going through the haunted floor of the hospital Io's conjurers in, having to collect chickens for Luca, the ship to Snover being raided by a band of pirates you'll never see again, crashing said ship and being forced to fix it in a small set of islands that you'll never have a reason to return to. Why on earth are these here? They're weaker than some of the side quests and add no substance to the story. There's multiple endings, but they all involve the last level, so you won't be forced to replay it all, which is good because you probably won't replay it in general. And the game compensates for its low replay value the same way I'd hope any RPG would, with the postgame. You can only obtain it via the true ending, which is the ending you're probably gonna get. I'm not saying the game straight up tells you how to get the true ending, but does give a cue in every part of the game where you're heading down the path of a bad ending, giving you a full opportunity to correct that. I won't go covering all the party members as there are quite a few, so I'm going to stick to one I think is worth highlighting. But which one will I cover? Maybe the one I think has the best backstory? Maybe the cutest one? Maybe my favorite one personality-wise? No, I think I'll cover the one that makes the entire story more interesting to me. So the character of the game for this review is going to be Nyx. Nyx has a distinct advantage in this, since she does appear multiple times throughout the story without being a primary focus in those chapters. But what makes her one of the more interesting characters is that she had feelings for her conjurer that have been heavily implied to go beyond platonic. The reason is that Mogwai care a lot about their conjurers, but human lifespans are fleeting compared to Mogwai, and the ritual to split their lifespan with a human is considered taboo. This means during this time, Nyx had to live with the fact that Eve Shin's life was going to be a blink compared to hers, or they would have to break said taboo if they wanted to live a long life together. But we don't know the actual consequences of doing such a thing and if it's merely social. This isn't merely an aspect I found interesting because it was between a human and a Mogwai, as there is another character with the same conflict throughout the story. But such an opportunity never had a chance to be seized, and the blink of a life was robbed from her from the disaster that took place in the den. Yet going through the trauma that turned her from a wisp to a reaper and feeling the death of her conjurer, she still managed to escape. And rather than attempting to run or hide, or try to live a new life, Nyx was still hell-bent on making things right. Her entire goal was to save Caesar. She became the catalyst that stopped the potential second war, although indirectly, she set the duel on the quest to make things right. I also really like that despite having a speech impediment throughout her life, it doesn't dictate her personality. Nyx is assertive, strong-willed, and somewhat vindictive. You can also tell that she very much hangs on to the past. The scarf she wears is a scarf of Eve Jin that was dropped when Clyde carried her out of the palace. Something that would be in the Queen's possession, and I honestly doubt that she just picked it up on her way out. She likely had to risk taking a detour to get her hands on that. But despite her loving Eve Jin the most, she is willing to put aside the loss of everything to amend the mistakes for those who remain. To work aside one of the people who wronged her, only to save another who led to that disaster. It definitely helps that Klein is working alongside their former conjurer's descendant, but she was never asked to do any of these things to begin with. She was the one who took initiative to kickstart this all. My only real complaint with Nyx in general is I think she's a bit too together for someone who is in her situation. When I was told what happened to her, I just went, okay, so you're telling me that Nyx, after experiencing the most traumatic event in her life, and then being imprisoned for 2 centuries, only suffered the change of becoming stronger, since that's what happens to a species when they experience heavy trauma? Well, that's awfully convenient. But outside of this, I didn't have any real complaints, and even with this, it's not a horrible plot hole or anything. We don't exactly know the mental fortitude of a Mogwai, so it didn't irk me too much. But seeing the overall track record of this character and how generally well written she is, I think Nyx is worthy of the spot of a character highlight. Okay, so back to the story. Let's break this all down. The story has a pretty repetitive flow for the first half due to having to go through woods from town to town and going to bed after defeating a few bosses. It also has, as mentioned earlier, areas that feel like filler, as there are several moments in the game that pad it out but never are mentioned again, which feels like it's done to prevent grinding, which at that point I just cut these parts out and scaled down everything else's numbers to compensate. I'm gonna be honest, it feels like there was a different set of rules made at the start of the game, and they went with a completely different set later on. An example of this is that it's treated that packless Mogs cannot use their human form, even though later in the game it is shown not to be the case. The human form of Mogwai is stronger than the Mogwai form, but despite this, Troz attempts to intimidate the Terra Trio in her Cerberus form. I understand she's probably doing this to impose her presence with her size, and this would certainly work against the average human, but the Terra Trio know very well how these forms work, and I think it supports the idea that initially, the Mogwai forms were the forms for power, while the human forms were the forms for practicality. Being able to integrate with human society and having opposable thumbs come with their own set of perks. Now, the rules will make sense either way, but it seems to flip-flop on the matter. June's presence throughout the game as a conjurer sets a premise that becomes more in-depth, and meeting other conjurers cements this idea. Conjurers don't always fill a combat role. In fact, combat conjurers are the minority. Conjurers will typically continue their normal life and fulfill their career, so most of them do not end up in a combat role. This results with conjurers having a ton of different potential ways to contribute to society, and for the Mogs to take up other hobbies. I do appreciate this because conjurers in this period of time are long past the war. It only makes sense that a lot of them fill non-combative roles. I find it even more odd that when Klein is told with the rest of the group that Wisp is responsible for stealing people's cores, and despite her very often reacting in ways that show she recognizes Nyx, it is strange that she never calls her out at any point. This can, however, be countered by Klein's fear of revealing her past to Eve, especially when Nyx doesn't recognize her, but the issue lies with the information Klein has. Nyx should be in a dungeon in the den, and the new general sent out a group of mercenaries to hunt down someone, so some den business is being bled over to the outset. At the same time, Nyx seems to be out and free. They should have set off more than enough warning lights to know that even if Nyx isn't the culprit, she's up to something. And again, Klein could have kept quiet in fear of revealing what she did for nothing, but it seems off that she thought that outweighed the high probability that she was the one responsible. It's not that Klein doesn't have a reason for not piping up, it's just I think the reason she does have is kind of weak. And yes, I'm sure it's not the no one to pick your fights mentality, because when the assailant is exiting the cave out of breath and giving cues that she had been in a really rough fight recently in front of a full party that's healthy enough and has the confidence to reach the grotto, that there would have been the opportune time to strike. Nothing really stood out in the story for me past this. Klein's story was a pretty well orchestrated chain of events that led to the downfall that has brought humanity and Mogwai to the distressful point they are today, and it does well in explaining why war is not completely off the table. We do see some humans act in paranoia, and Snilver is a good example of humans' distrust towards Mogwai, but I kinda wish I saw more emergency plans, shelters, maybe robots being given a setting to prepare to face against Mogs as the time came. Tensions are supposed to be high, but humans seem horribly underprepared. But the story does do well in explaining the motivations of every antagonist. Actually, no, I do have a few qualms with the writing when it comes to Queen Han's perspective. The Queen, after Klein attempts to assassinate her, uses the human dagger as a means of framing Eve Jin so that she has an excuse to execute her and achieve her goal of spiting Caesar by killing his conjurer. When Eve Jin's great-granddaughter shows up, she talks about how much she despises humans and how she wants to go back to the brief period of life when humans left Solum and Mogwai Rome and rebuilt the civilization on their own. I understand the Queen's conjurer was an abusive person, and the Queen constantly compares modern times to pre-human return era, and that these factors warp the Queen's perception of humanity. But the Queen acts as if she was betrayed by humans here, when in reality the only person in the group that didn't know about the affair between the king and the general was the human. So she attempted to have the human killed as some sort of power move, and when Klein attempts to kill her instead, she uses that to frame the human. Which, by the way, thank goodness Mogwai didn't believe that, because if they did, imagine trying to prevent the continual of a war after humanity's ambassador attempted to kill the Queen. That'd be a political nightmare. Hell, I think the war would have erupted if the Queen's plan worked as well. Let me remind you that she wanted to have humanity's ambassador killed because of palace drama she wasn't involved in. And none of this would have been a problem if she didn't know for a fact that it wasn't Eve Jin who tried to kill her. And then when one of her descendants reaches the throne room, not to kill her but to free the person she's been flailing around for 2 centuries, she attempts to seize her soul and use her body. The same person who thoroughly went through the work to make sure that the person the queen is imprisoning can be freed, but also the queen herself is not harmed. The queen had done all of this, but had the audacity to blame humanity for Solem's problems. If she is gonna be mad about anything, she should be mad about the Snovarians killing her husband when he made a run for it into their territory. He was trespassing and they had no idea what was going on, but having her husband killed and not knowing whatever happened to her child seems like a much better breaking point of the opinion of humanity. At least I think it's better than that darn girl not dying so that I can make a point to one of my subordinates. Speaking of Han, let's go back to the final boss fight in the true ending run. For those who weren't keeping count because they weren't ready that time, here's a replay. You fight her possessing Caesar. You fight her possessing Caesar again, but don't hit him and break the chains. You fight all your friends in the artificial core. You fight her posing as all the friends you fought in the artificial core, ending with her human form. You then fight her dragon form and lose. You then face her one more time with a combination of all the aforementioned friends and defeat her in her god form. By the time we reached beating her in her human form, I was just thinking to myself, holy crap, we're not done yet? It's been an hour since I entered the throne room, and I hadn't had to at any point restart. So yeah, I could have used some trimming down, and I'm not trying to sound hypocritical saying that to those who are looking at the timestamp while I'm saying this. I also noticed that Han changes to her dragon form to defeat Eve when she can't defeat her possessing Caesar, using any of the forms in the artificial core, or her human form. Wait, what? But the game establishes that the human form is stronger than the Mog form. I won't accept but she's a dragon because although that makes sense, you'd think it would also apply to a Minotaur or a Cerberus. The weird part is that this is completely avoidable. They could have had her switch to her dragon form, start to lose, then switch to her ultimate form and one-shot Eve. That's not a Mog form, that's a God form. But even then, it wouldn't get rid of the gripe I have with the God form. I felt like Han being a godly being who was settled for wreaking havoc on humanity was 100% unnecessary. I know it's written in the lore that way and some revisions would have to be done to not have it, but frankly this doesn't change the stakes. Although Han's goal of wiping out the outset in humanity hasn't changed, this sort of felt like it was simply done to try to raise the scale of how powerful Han is and make it feel like a doomsday moment. When at the end of the day, Han didn't really need to be this powerful, and her goal didn't need to be to wipe out humanity, because now it just seems strange that she waited so long. From what we see in the events that play out in the game, if the Den in the outset were to go to war, the Den would win. This is without the Queen using her powers. The General could have easily orchestrated it all when given the green light or authority to do so. Let me take a bit to explain. The outset is terrorized and put into a state of chaos at one point in the story from the General provoking feral Mogs in the wild to attack towns, and is also capable of making Mogwai with conjurers go enraged. The General was able to do all this without a single soldier, and in these moments, Mogs and conjurers appear to be their only forms of defense, which conjurers make up 4% of the human population, and even less of them are battle ready, and the other defenders could at any moment involuntarily go turncoat. Once those fall, and they will through attrition of their own Mogs turning on them, there's not much left, so the Den doesn't need to be in its prime to sweep up. The only place that would last is Snover due to the people there being hardy and well trained in fighting Mogwai, and not depending on them for defenses. But they'll be taking the brunt of the war to begin with as they hold the entrance between the outset and the Den, and once Snover falls, the rest of the outset is pretty much doomed. The best case scenario for humanity is that they do have a few options to possibly escape with their lives. The opportunity to stop a second war is already enough motivation, but it's even less desirable when you know you won't last long enough to even negotiate peace this time around. This is more than enough reason. The Queen doesn't have to start floating around, I'm already spooked. One thing I wanted to point out near the end was that Han insisted she gets an apology from Caesar for what he's done, and that kind of reminds me. Caesar feels kind of underutilized in the story. You never know much about him until Klein tells you her part of the story, and you never really interact with him until near the very end. I feel like he could have been fleshed out more. After all, saving him is the motivation of the person you're chasing for the majority of the game. I would enjoy to hear about his struggles and the moments where Caesar is able to surface when Han loses grip for moments. His body was paraded around as a warning to those who oppose her, but it might have been interesting if others took the message that she is no better than a brute, or if Rex had mentioned that she's unsure about the Queen's greater good. Using Dad's body as a fleshy marionette does seem iffy. Also, while Han's in the mood for apologies, will Nyx get an apology for being imprisoned for something she hadn't really been involved in? Will Eve get an apology for Han destroying her ancestor's life and also attempting to kill her multiple times simply to spite someone else? Is humanity gonna get an apology for being put at risk of another war due to royal drama they had absolutely nothing to do with? I don't think getting their ambassador position back cuts it. What about when she took Caesar's body, suppressed his conscience, and makes him watch in horror as she uses him as a glorified set piece? Look, I know he wronged her pretty bad, but she did put the two in hellish experiences for 2 centuries. In the post-game, when you get to talk to him afterwards, his comment is how he is kind of let down that the queen named his kid. He didn't really want her to be named Rex. I can't begin to state how much of a good sport this man has to be for that to be the first thing he says involving the queen after what he's been through. The worst part is I don't know if this is out of character or not because, well, frankly, I barely got to know him. He does seem a bit too okay with this, kinda like Nyx, but I think you get the picture about that. Now that I mentioned the post-game, I want to talk about the post-game content. Heartbeat has what is the best post-game content I've experienced in an RPG without an expansion. Mind you, it definitely helps the version I'm playing is 1.2. The game has a lot of time to release updates before I got my hands on it. But it has bits of extra story and content that flesh out things that were revealed in side quests. Look at this, I'm in an ancient human terraforming ship. This is a fishing quest. And the ship is full of logs about how Solon was about to die and humanity left to the stars, only to be chased out and have to return to Solon. It was miraculously restored at the cost of many Elder Mogwai's life. They accepted humanity back in and began trading with them. The game has tons of world building even outside of these logs giving exposition, like when you travel to the mines which used to be used to mass produce weapons in the war, or when you enter a construction yard that's being terrorized by Mogwai because machinery interferes with magic. There's a lot more of this in the post game, but a lot of it's given through you in walls of text. Mind you, you have to go very much out of your way to find this stuff, but it is a lot of lore, and honestly, it might be a bit too much at some points. Did you know Mogs can only make pacts with humans that are compatible, which is based on their sex? Did you know there was an exception to this rule? That's right, the Wuxi conjures, which are a rare case of humans that can make pacts with 3 Mogwai instead of 1 conjures writing that village of pacts not only help Mogwai heal, but also did you know humanity can turn from livestock and why they far more vulnerable than normal wildlife, and that's why normal animals look so strange. Do you know the lifespan of a Mogwai? Yeah, neither do I. So when it comes to Heartbeat's post-game content, it will often range from one of the couple of mini areas where you can fight an assortment of NPCs you never had the chance to fight in-game, which is a nice bit of extra content, and the really extensive quest lines the game has. It's some really cool stuff that offers something new for people who want more lore, and for people who want new fights, giving you some meaningful one-time only content, along with stuff that you can experience multiple times. It's usually for its own stake and for story-related experiences though, and the few times they offer rewards is kinda weak. You're telling me I faced off against a boss and used strategies to avoid getting one-shotted only to get one-shotted anyway for a slightly better weapon for one of my party members? The means of getting to the dungeon and the dungeon itself was way cooler than the final fight. So the post-game's questlines have pretty cool journeys and kind of weak destinations, but let's be honest, in a single player RPG, you're not going in the post-game for the loot. Now that everything's covered, I think it's time to make a verdict. So, as a whole, Heartbeat is a game with a very endearing art style, but painfully standard combat. It's definitely the weakest part, which takes its toll for a game this long. The story was alright, it definitely gets more interesting as time goes on, but I feel like it tries to get too extravagant at the end and doesn't focus enough on certain characters. And the game has a lot of world building, definitely enough to make a series. I think it's got a decent cast of characters, maybe a few too many, but they all stand out with their own appearance and personality, and are consistently written throughout the game. The game deviates from the rules made in the narrative sometimes, but it's nothing plot-breaking, so make of that what you will. If you're looking for a game where you want to really be drawn into the world and learn all there is about it, well, almost all there is about it, this might be a good fit for you, but the problem is, will it be intriguing and entertaining enough for you to want to learn about it in the first place? And with how the game plays with the party members it gives you at all times, I don't see there being a super high replay value, so maybe it being as long as it is a strength to some people. The way I see it, for $15 you could do far worse, but it also requires patience of having a somewhat bland combat system, which contrasts greatly with the rest of the game. I would recommend playing the demo first, although it is an older version of the game, is more or less the same. And if you're not drawn into the game by the end of the demo, I'd say pass on this one. But if you get drawn into the game for its art and story, you'll most certainly get your money's worth. And that concludes my review of Heartbeat. I hope you all have a good day, and be safe.